There are certain fighters in the UFC who have declined to fight a certain opponent due to it being a bad matchup for them. So here is 10 times UFC fighters ducked opponents. Number 10. Tony Ferguson was set to face Khabib Nurmagomedov for the interim UFC lightweight title at UFC 209. Khabib fell ill on the day of the weigh-ins and was removed from the event. Michael Johnson, who had already defeated Tony Ferguson at UFC on Fox 3, stepped in on a day's notice to face Tony Ferguson. When the late replacement was offered to Tony Ferguson, he declined the last-minute opponent change, saying that the UFC was going to cut his show money and decided it wasn't worth fighting Michael Johnson. Number 9. Vitor Belfort was scheduled to face then UFC middleweight champion Chris Weidman at UFC 184. Leading up to the event, Chris Weidman sustained an injury whilst training and was forced to pull out. The UFC offered Vitor Belfort an interim title fight against Lyoto Machida, who had just defeated CB Dollaway at UFC 58, but Vitor Belfort declined the fight, saying that he had spent 8 weeks of training just for Chris Weidman and only wanted to face him. Number 8. Back in 2012, Mauricio Shogun was scheduled to face Thiago Silva in a 3-round light heavyweight bout. Leading up to the fight, Thiago Silva suffered an injury and was forced to pull out. The UFC contacted Glover Teixeira, who had just made his UFC debut, defeating Carlos Kingsbury, extending his winning streak to 16 in a row. When Shogun was offered Glover Teixeira as a potential opponent, he immediately declined, saying that he wasn't a top 10 fighter, but accepted Brandon Vera, who wasn't in the top 10 rankings. Number 7. When Ronda Rousey was the champion, she was just blitzing fighters in a matter of minutes where she looked unbeatable. But there was only one fighter that the fans thought would give her problems. This was Cris Cyborg. Both fighters were talking trash to each other and the fans wanted to see this fight happen. Cris Cyborg offered to fight her at a catch weight of 140 pounds, but Ronda Rousey wanted her to make the full cut to the 135 pounds. Ronda Rousey made only one exception for a catch weight bout, which would be against Gina Carano, not Cris Cyborg. Number 6. At the end of 2014, the UFC wanted to set up a main event matchup in Australia between Hector Lombard and Tyron Woodley. Both fighters were nearing title contention and the winner of this fight would move a step closer to a title shot. When the fight was offered to Tyron Woodley, he immediately declined to fight Hector Lombard, saying that he was a teammate and would not fight him. Hector Lombard wanted to fight him and didn't care about being on the same team. Both fighters couldn't come to an agreement and the fight never happened. Number 5. Eddie Alvarez finished Rafael dos Anjos by TKO in the first round at UFC Fight Night 90 to become the new UFC lightweight champion of the world. The clear number 1 contender at that time was Khabib Nurmagomedov. The UFC had sent Khabib 2 different contracts for the title fight at UFC 205 and UFC 206. Eddie Alvarez preferred to fight Conor McGregor as he thought it would be a best suited matchup for his skills. Just a couple of weeks later, the UFC announced that Eddie Alvarez would be defending his UFC lightweight title against then UFC featherweight champion Conor McGregor at UFC 205. Number 4. Conor McGregor knocked out Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds of the first round at UFC 194 to become the new UFC featherweight champion of the world. The clear number 1 contender at that time was Frankie Edgar, who had put together a 5-fight winning streak. Conor McGregor's first title defense should have been against Frankie Edgar, but he had other plans. He had his eyes set on then UFC lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos. Frankie Edgar was matched up against Jose Aldo at UFC 200 for the interim UFC featherweight title, where Jose Aldo won the fight by unanimous decision. Number 3. TJ Dillashaw was set to face Cody Garbrandt for the UFC bantamweight title at UFC 213. Leading up to the event, Cody Garbrandt injured his back and was forced to pull out the event. With TJ Dillashaw without an opponent, he targeted UFC flyweight champion Demetrious Johnson, saying that he would cut down to 125 pounds and fight him for the title. When Demetrious Johnson heard this, he immediately declined to fight TJ Dillashaw, saying he would only accept to fight him if he dropped down to the division and had a couple of fights just to guarantee that he could make the weight. In the end, the fight never materialized. Number 2. Back in 2016, Yoel Romero had just knocked out former champion Chris Weidman at UFC 205, putting together an 8-fight winning streak where he stood out as the clear number 1 contender for the title. The champion Michael Bisping didn't seem interested in the fight and campaigned to fight former UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre. Yoel Romero tried his best to get the fight to happen, but the UFC booked Michael Bisping to defend his title against GSP at UFC 213. When GSP said that he needed more time to prepare to fight at middleweight, a number 1 contender bout between Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker was set as a main event for UFC 213. Which would now be for the interim UFC middleweight title. After 5 rounds, the unanimous decision was given to Robert Whittaker. Number 1. Germaine De Randa faced Holly Holm for the vacant UFC Women's Featherweight title, where after the 5 rounds, the unanimous decision was given to Germaine De Randa, becoming the first champion of the division. The clear challenger for the title was the dominant Invicta FC Featherweight champion Cris Cyborg. As soon as Joe Rogan mentioned Cris Cyborg's name in the post-fight interview, Germaine De Randa immediately said that she had torn ligaments in her hand and needed to get that fixed. Later she said that she would never fight Cris Cyborg due to her testing positive for banned substances in the past, and even vacated the title due to not wanting to fight Cris Cyborg.